Let's talk about the American Revolution today. It is a highly creative invention of the Americans. Let's see how it came about. It was based on the writings of John Locke. Locke said, "Government can never have a right to destroy, enslave, or designedly to impoverish the subjects." That became the watchword for the Americans. They felt that the British government was treating them unfairly, and they decided to correct that problem. Let's see why they thought that way. We can set the stage by going back to the French and Indian War, also called the 7 Years' War. The colonies initially enjoyed a lot of tax freedoms and immunities. The people in England, Parliament said, well, they're so far away, they really don't enjoy all of the benefits, so we won't tax them as heavily. But after the war, Britain thought that these colonies should shoulder the financial burden of protection from the French, who still remained close by in some threatening ways in Louisiana. Therefore, the British government started to impose new taxes, and the Americans felt like they were being taken advantage of. The colonies didn't see the protection as necessary, and so they were angry at the new taxes and started to rebel. The first point was a proclamation in 1763 where King George III forbade the colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. He did that so that England would continue to have colonial control in a more powerful and direct way on the other side of the Appalachians. The Americans just simply ignored it, and they resented it, and they moved into the area beyond the Appalachians. But there was a tone set between King George and the Americans of distrust and anger. Then, a year later, there was an act called the Sugar Act, and it placed a 3-cent tax on each gallon of molasses from outside of the British Empire. This was one of those new taxes, and there were protests and finally replacement of the law. Then there was a Stamp Act in 1765, and that required the colonists to pay for tax stamps on newspapers and various legal documents. Again, a new tax. It angered the Americans. They protested, and Parliament abolished the act a year later. Then we had the Townshend Act. They placed a duty on imported goods, including glass and lead, paint, tea, and paper. The Americans responded by smuggling in those things, and there was a lively smuggling business going on in America. It made the British angry because, remember, the British were merchants and they wanted to make a profit, and when smuggling occurred, they could not make the profit. So not only did the smuggling deny them the normal profits, but it also denied them the taxes. The Tea Act of 1773 was Parliament's attempt to stop this smuggling. And it made it possible for the East India Company, the seller of most of the tea, to sell below the price of the smuggled tea, so that the British merchants could at least capture some of the profits, and there could be some taxes gathered as well. The result of that act was the Boston Tea Party, where tea was thrown into the harbor. That was done on December 16, 1773, with Samuel Adams leading the Patriots, who were disguised as Indians. They dumped that tea overboard. That really made the British mad, and they enacted the Intolerable Acts of 1774. They closed Boston's harbor. They took away almost all of the power of the Massachusetts legislature, and they controlled the colony by military order. It was a bad time for Massachusetts. In that setting, a group of representatives from each of the colonies got together and formed the First Continental Congress. They met from September 5th to October 26th in 1774. It was, all of the colonies were represented except Georgia, and they met in Philadelphia to decide what to do about these intolerable acts. They decided to stop trade with Great Britain. Now we would call that a boycott. And they also decided to prepare for war because they could see the inevitability of a conflict coming with Great Britain. They decided to meet again in May of 1775. The British presence in Massachusetts began to chafe the Americans, and they decided to resist with armed conflict. And on the fateful night in April of 1775, Paul Revere waited until he could see a signal from Old North Church as to whether the British were going to go from downtown Boston to Concord by land or by sea, land or sea being the way that they were going to get out of downtown Boston. Paul Revere then ran along the route and notified the Patriots, and they gathered first at Lexington to stop the British advance. They were defeated at Lexington, and they continued on, the British continued on to Concord, and there they found nothing. And in fact, the Americans fought them at the bridge at Concord and scored a victory. They harassed the British troops all the way back to Boston, killing many of them. And that really made the British Army angry. Then we had the meeting of the Second Continental Congress as scheduled in May of 1775. War had broken out then, Lexington and Concord. And therefore, the Americans created a Continental Army in response to the battles at Lexington and Concord. There was an attempt at reconciliation, but both sides were too angry and that was not going to happen. The Continental Congress decided to adjourn because they did not have a mandate from the people to declare war. And so they went back and asked their constituents whether they should declare independence or whether they should attempt even further reconciliation. Hence, there was an abandonment of the Congress. In early 1776, the elections were held. Prior to those elections, a book came out. It was a small pamphlet type book written by Thomas Paine. It was called Common Sense. And in this pamphlet, Thomas Paine, a recently arrived Englishman, just lambasted King George on a personal note and the British government in general. Let's just read what he said in part. "But where, say some, is the King of America? I'll tell you, friend, he reigns above, and doth not make havoc of mankind like the royal brute of Britain, so far as we approve of monarchy, that in America the law is king." So here's Thomas Paine ridiculing the British king and stating that law is the king in America. The Second Continental Congress met, and because of Thomas Paine's book, there was tremendous support across the colonies, and the group that was elected to the Second Continental Congress's second session were strongly in favor of independence. And therefore, the government, army, supplies, and other things were all decided by this group, and it became the effective government throughout the rest of the war. A proposal to draft a resolution on independence was approved, and Thomas Jefferson was asked by the committee to be the principal drafter. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and one or two others were included in that committee. I think it's valuable for us to read the first draft, at least in part, of the Declaration of Independence, because in it we can see some of the words of John Locke, But we also see, interestingly enough, some of the corrections that were made by the committee. They smoothed it out and made it more powerful. Here's the first draft. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for a people to advance from that subordination in which they have hitherto remained, and to assume among powers of the earth the equal and independent station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the change. It's a little bit vague, isn't it? I think that we need to have a little stronger Declaration of Independence, and that was pointed out, and the committee worked on the Declaration of Independence, and it became a much more powerful document. How creative was it? Well, I think you can see differences of opinion. One opinion was given by John Adams, who was actually on the committee. He said, "There is not an idea in it but what had been hackneyed in Congress for 2 years before. The substance of it is contained in the Declaration of Rights and the violation of those rights in the Journals of Congress in 1774. Indeed, the essence of it is contained in a pamphlet voted and printed by the town of Boston before the first Congress met, composed by James Otis." Well, John Adams wasn't very happy with the Declaration of Independence. At least he wasn't happy with the feeling that Thomas Jefferson was solely responsible for its creation. And surely that's true. Jefferson admits that he received a lot of credit or a lot of help from others. Look at this video where Jefferson, played by an actor, gives a little discussion.
Fortunes and our sacred honor. Citizens, I thank you for listening to my reflections, my recollections of that pathway towards our Declaration, and yet many have asked me, well, what is the essential influence? What is indeed the author of the greatest import within that document? I'm sorry, but perhaps I should answer you as I have already written. There's not one new or original thought in the Declaration. No, we did not set out to say things that have never been said before. We did not set out with any new principles that had never been thought of. Everything in the Declaration has been written before. It has been argued and debated before, and you all may find it in the elementary books of public right. The works of Aristotle, Cicero, Algernon Sidney, and John Locke. The work of my pen, the work of the committee, was simply to shed the lofty sophisms of these ancient authors and explain it all in clear and simple terms, so that everyone might understand it. To put before the world the expression of the American mind. To put before mankind, indeed, the common sense of the subject in terms so plain, in terms so firm, as to command their assent, and thereby to help the world understand that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a few booted and spurred, ready to ride them. Thank you.
In spite of that, I'd like to read a second opinion about the creativity of the Declaration of Independence, this time from Winston Churchill. "We must never cease to proclaim in fearless tones the great principles of freedom and the rights of man, which are the joint inheritance of the English-speaking world, and which, through Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, the habeas corpus, trial by jury, and the English common law, find their expression in the Declaration of Independence." Clearly, Winston Churchill believes that this document was one of the great documents of history, and I have to agree with him. I think Thomas Jefferson was incredibly creative. And there are others who think that. Look at what John F. Kennedy said. He was President of the United States and hosting a dinner of Nobel Prize winners in the White House. He said, "This is perhaps the greatest collection of intellects to ever dine in the White House, with the exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined here alone." Isn't that a lovely little statement? Well, here were the Americans little tiny group of colonists, lacking resources, lacking an army, trying to put together the best citizen army that they could, and they were fighting the most powerful country in the world. How did they do it? One of the ways that the Americans were victorious is because they changed the way of fighting, the method of fighting. When the British fought, they lined up in 3 rows. They had their bright red uniforms on. They were called lobsterbacks. And they marched in full splendor across the field, hoping that they would frighten the other side. The other army was on the other side of the field, and as the British army approached them, the other army became frightened and almost always fired very, very quickly, much too soon to be effective in their firepower. As at the first volley then, the British army ran as fast as they could, maintaining their lines across the field. And just as the other side was about to the point where they were reloaded, the British army stopped, and then, at very close range, the first rank fired a shot. They knelt down and started to reload. The second rank then fired a shot, and then they pulled back, and the third rank leaned forward, and they fired a shot. So it's shot, shot, shot. Very quick succession, causing devastation at such a short range with such high firepower. And then the British army ran on the attack and bayoneted the other side. But with the Americans, it was different. The Americans were arrayed on the other side of the field, and the British army approached them, and they came closer and closer and closer. But the word among the Americans was, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." That meant, wait until the British are so close that your firing is going to devastate the British side. And then, as the Americans fired and the British charged them, trying to get up close, they were already close, the Americans simply ran away. That system proved to be highly effective against the British Army. Some other reasons that the Americans won is that they did have some experienced war veterans from the French and Indian War. They had what we could call the home court advantage. The people were fighting for their land and their very homes. They were familiar with the opposition, that is, many of them had been in the British Army, but the Brits were unfamiliar with the American system. They used these guerrilla warfare tactics, as I've suggested, and they also fought from behind trees and other things in the wilderness. Great Britain had tremendously long supply lines. It took at least 6 weeks for communication to turn around between the United States and Britain. The Americans scored a few outstanding victories, and those victories charged the Americans with renewed life, and they also brought in support from overseas, and that's another issue that helped the Americans, support from the French, both military and political, as well as economic. Many of the British were apathetic or even sympathizers who believed that the Americans had a just cause. The Americans were obviously very, very passionate, and there was a tremendous theater of war that was difficult for the British to cover, all the way from New England down to Georgia. The Revolutionary War ended with the last major battle at Yorktown on a peninsula in Virginia. It ended because Cornwallis, who is considered by many to be the best British general, surrendered to Washington. The reason that he was forced to surrender is because he had marched down the peninsula thinking that it'd be picked up by ships and taken down to North Carolina, but the ships were held back by the French fleet, and therefore Cornwallis was isolated on the peninsula with no chance of getting off, and he was just simply crushed by the power of Washington's army. As soon as that happened, there was great discouragement in Britain, and therefore the ambassador to France, that was Benjamin Franklin, went over to London and pointed to the discouraging conditions in England because of this defeat, and with great diplomatic skill, he was able to get the British to concede that the war should be ended, and a treaty was signed in Paris in 1783. Franklin was helped in these negotiations by John Adams, who had been the ambassador to Paris for a short time, but then went up to Holland to obtain the permission and the support of the Dutch. When that happened, both France and Holland were quick to recognize the independence of the Americans. Another factor in America's victory was George Washington. He was loved of his people because he worked so hard and he did so well. Respected by everybody, and obviously was the unopposed choice as first president of the United States. He ran 2 terms, felt that that was sufficient. He resigned and went back to his farm. Some people have said that Washington returning to his farm was one of the most important events in the history of the United States, because it meant that we would never have a king, because the precedent had been set by this great American, George Washington. In fact, he was so well liked that upon his death, a naval battle between France and England was stopped, and for an hour the flags were lowered in memory of George Washington. That's pretty good. What was creative about America's fight for independence? Remember that the concepts of creativity are to have value, to have intent, to have novelty, and to have excellence of implementation. Certainly, the values were there. It was valuable to the Americans that they be independent. They were able to start a new kind of government with a completely new concept. Their intent was certainly to gain independence, and they won it with great fervor. It was novel. People had not fought for a new country based on principles. In the past, new countries had been formed because of ethnic conflicts. And most other countries were the land of the Franks, the land of the Angles, the land of the Germans. But America was not the land of any ethnic group. It was the land of a concept, the concept of freedom. We were really the land of the free. The excellence of implementation is evidenced in the Constitution, which some people declare to be the greatest political document ever written. How could Great Britain have been more creative and make it a win-win? Well, I'm not so sure. They may have tried to declare independence, but or to continue to fight the independence, but more probably they could have done what they finally ended up doing with Canada and perhaps Australia. They could have created a Commonwealth where America would have been independent, but still could have had some kind of an association. But the personalities wouldn't allow it. America needed to show its independence, and it fought for that and was successful. John Adams was one of those personalities that would not allow any kind of step except independence. In looking back on what happened in the American independence, he reportedly said the following: "I must study politics and war that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. My sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture in order to give their children the right to study paintings, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain." In essence, first comes politics, then comes science and business, and then comes the humanities. We can see it as a pyramid where national survival is the foundation, economic stability is next, and cultural refinement is the capstone. That's a lesson of history that John Adams certainly saw. We established a marvelous government based on the Roman model. And along with that, we established the principles of liberty called the Bill of Rights. Aristotle looked at governments and he said that if the ruler is a single person, a stable form of that would be a monarchy, but an unstable form would be a despot. If the ruler is a small group, then the stable form is called an aristocracy and an unstable form is an oligarchy. If the ruler is a large group, the stable form is called a democracy. The unstable form is called mob rule. What we see is a very interesting combination, and that is what the Romans did. They took the stable form, combined them together, and called it a republic. So there's some elements of single person rule, the executive, some elements of small group rule, the Senate, some elements of large group rule, the House of Representatives, and other issues as well. The Constitution was ratified in 1787, replaced the Articles of Confederation that were temporary. The Bill of Rights was added shortly thereafter, and all of that was written under the tutelage of James Madison, who had to compromise in order to allow it to come out. And that compromise was giving some rights to the states that he was afraid of. He thought that the states were too powerful, but nevertheless, the states gained some power. There were compromises then between efficiency versus checks and balances, states' rights versus federal power, and power of the majority versus rights of the minority. In our case, the Supreme Court could review laws, and if the law, even though enacted by the majority, was unconstitutional, it could be thrown out. We have the Electoral College, which removes direct election of the president, again, as a check and balance against the power of the majority over the minority. And slavery was allowed to continue to exist in the South as a compromise. Benjamin Franklin comments on this document. It astonishes me to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does. And the British Prime Minister said, the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man. Surely those things are consistent with the statements of the Lord, where he said, I, the Lord, established the constitution of this land by the hands of wise men whom I raised up unto this very purpose, and redeemed the land by the shedding of blood. A young Frenchman named Alexis de Tocqueville toured America and then reported his tour in a book called Democracy in America. He saw the desire for freedom among the Americans, and this is what he reported. The revolution of the United States was the result of a mature and reflecting preference for freedom, and not of a vague or ill-defined craving for independence. It was never assumed in the United States that the citizen of a free country has a right to do whatever he pleases. On the contrary, more social obligations were there imposed upon him than anywhere else. Tocqueville discusses the rule of law. The people in America obey the law, not only because it is their own work, but because it may be changed if it is harmful. A law is observed because, first, it is a self-imposed evil, and secondly, it is an evil of transient duration because, again, the Americans can change it. Are there laws that were so popular that they were or should be changed? Have we ever had laws like that? Of course. One of the most common examples is prohibition. It was an unpopular law. Many people just simply ignored it. They became lawless. That's a problem. Whenever a large number of people combine together to break a law, it seems to me that the law needs to be changed. It indicates that there is a bad law. You wonder what ought to happen with traffic laws. Maybe they're bad laws too. Maybe there's a better way to set speed limits because so many people do violate the traffic laws. What do you think about some of the laws that some people are proposing that would surely have widespread disobedience? A law against abortion. I think that if a law against abortion were enacted, that many people in the United States would ignore it. I think the LDS Church has taken the right approach. They are absolutely opposed to abortion, but rather than press for a law against abortion, they educate against abortion, and when a woman is pregnant with a pregnancy that she does not want, they encourage adoption. That seems to be a more logical approach than a draconian law against abortion, which is doomed to fail. Similarly, we see widespread ignoring of the immigration laws, not only by people coming in who are illegal aliens, but we see it ignored by people within the United States who employ them. Therefore, it seems to me that the immigration laws need to be rewritten so that there are not widespread numbers of people who ignore them, both Americans and illegals. Tocqueville also said, "America is great because she is good. If America ceases to be good, America will cease to be great." I think that's food for thought. He talks about freedom of the press. The sovereignty of the people and the liberty of the press may therefore be regarded as correlative. In order to enjoy the inestimable benefits that the liberty of the press ensures, it is necessary to submit to the inevitable evils that it creates. It is an axiom of political science in that country, America, that the only way to neutralize the effect of the public journals is to multiply their number. In essence, you should not try and suppress the press. If some newspaper says something you don't like, then you just should start another newspaper and say what you do like. The competition of ideas should be open and straightforward. Tocqueville also makes an interesting comment about women in America. He says, "Thus the Americans do not think that man and woman have either the duty or the right to perform the same offices, but they show an equal regard for both their respective parts. And though their lot is different, they consider both of them as beings of equal value." If I were asked to what the singular prosperity and growing strength of that people, the Americans, ought mainly to be attributed, I should reply, to the superiority of their women. An interesting concept. I support it completely. Thank you. Appreciate your listening.